Picture this. It's a crisp October morning in 1700, and you're standing in the opulent halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. The air smells of beeswax candles, imported Turkish coffee, and the faint musk of political intrigue that clings to every royal court like expensive perfume. Somewhere in these gilded corridors, a decision is being made that will reshape the map of Europe and send millions of men to their graves over the next 13 years. But the men making this decision aren't thinking about graveyards. They're thinking about a throne, a crown, and a very complicated family tree that's about to catch fire. Welcome to the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict so tangled in royal bloodlines, so drenched in dynastic pride, and so catastrophically expensive that it makes modern political scandals look like neighborhood squabbles. This isn't just about armies clashing on muddy battlefields, though there will be plenty of that. This is about what happens when Europe's most powerful families decide to settle their inheritance disputes with cannons instead of lawyers. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well for anyone involved. Least of all the millions of soldiers, civilians, and taxpayers who will pay the price for royal vanity. The whole mess starts with one man dying childless and another man wanting what he can't have. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of that troubled dynasty, lies on his deathbed in Madrid, drooling slightly and contemplating the end of his genetic line. His jaw is so malformed he can barely chew solid food. His tongue is too large for his mouth. His legs are different lengths. Centuries of royal inbreeding have turned him into a walking advertisement for genetic diversity, and now he's about to take his empire to the grave with him. But Charles has a problem beyond his obvious physical ailments. He has no children, no direct heirs, and an empire that stretches from Spain to the Netherlands, from Naples to the New World. The Spanish Empire is the richest, most sprawling territorial prize in Europe, and every major power wants a piece of it. Charles knows that the moment he dies, the vultures will descend. So he makes a choice that will set the continent ablaze. He writes a will, not just any will, mind you. This is a document that will be debated, contested, and fought over with the kind of fury usually reserved for tavern brawls and theological disputes. In it, Charles names Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. The entire Spanish inheritance, all of it, goes to a French prince. One signature and suddenly the most powerful empire in Europe belongs to the most powerful king in Europe. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who already controls France and most of its neighbors, now has a legitimate claim to Spain and everything it owns. If you're sitting in London, Vienna, or Amsterdam right now, this news hits you like a bucket of ice water to the face. Louis XIV already dominates European politics. His armies are the finest on the continent. His court at Versailles is the envy of every rival monarch. His diplomats negotiate from positions of strength that make other kingdoms look like country estates. And now, thanks to one dying man's will, he's about to add the Spanish Empire to his collection. This isn't just a succession crisis. This is the potential unification of Europe under French hegemony, and every other power knows it. The reaction is swift and predictable. Emperor Leopold I of Austria, who has his own claim to the Spanish throne through his Habsburg bloodline, is furious. William III of England, who has spent his entire reign fighting French expansion, is apoplectic. The Dutch, who've been resisting French dominance for decades, start mobilizing immediately. Even smaller powers like Savoy and Portugal begin choosing sides. What started as a family inheritance dispute is about to become the world's first truly global war. But before we dive into the carnage, let's meet the players in this royal drama. Because understanding this war means understanding the personalities, ambitions, and petty grudges that drove entire nations to ruin. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, is 62 years old and at the height of his power. He's ruled France for over 40 years, transforming it from a collection of feudal territories into the most centralized, most militarily formidable state in Europe. His palace at Versailles is a monument to royal absolutism, where every minor noble in France comes to grovel for favor, and every foreign ambassador comes to marvel at French grandeur. Louis doesn't just rule France, he embodies it. When he famously declared "L'été, c'est moi," he wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact. Louis has spent his entire reign expanding French borders and French influence. He's fought the Dutch, the Germans, the Spanish, the English, sometimes all at once. His armies have conquered territories from Flanders to Franche-Comté. His diplomats have negotiated treaties that favor France at every turn. His cultural influence has made French the language of international diplomacy, and Versailles the model for royal courts across Europe. He's not just a king, he's a brand. And now, with the Spanish succession, he has a chance to make that brand continental. On the other side stands Emperor Leopold I of Austria, a man whose family has been collecting crowns for centuries. The Habsburgs have ruled the Holy Roman Empire since the 15th century, controlled Spain until now, and accumulated titles, territories, and grievances like some families collect china. Leopold is personally mild-mannered, deeply religious, and obsessed with music and mathematics. But he's also the head of a dynasty that considers itself the rightful heir to Charlemagne's empire, and he's not about to let the French take what he believes belongs to Austria. Leopold's claim to Spain isn't just political, it's personal. His first wife was Spanish. His mother was Spanish. Half the Habsburg family tree has Spanish branches. From his perspective, Charles II's will isn't just wrong, it's an insult to centuries of Habsburg rule. The Spanish crown belongs to his family, and he's prepared to fight the entire continent to prove it. Then there's William III of England, a Dutch prince who conquered his way onto the English throne and has spent every day since trying to prevent French domination of Europe. William is small, asthmatic, and perpetually ill, but he's also one of the most determined men in European politics. He's built his entire career on opposing Louis XIV, and he's not about to stop now just because some Spanish king decided to bequeath his empire to France. William understands something that many of his contemporaries miss. This war isn't really about Spanish succession. It's about the balance of power in Europe. If Louis XIV gets Spain, France becomes too powerful for any coalition to check. The result will be French hegemony, French terms, and French dominance of European trade, diplomacy, and culture. For William, this war is existential. England either fights now or accepts permanent subordination to French power. The players aren't limited to monarchs, though. This conflict will be shaped by generals, diplomats, and merchants whose names history barely remembers, but whose decisions will determine the fate of millions. There's John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, whose military genius will revolutionize European warfare. There's Prince Eugene of Savoy, an Austrian general whose tactical innovations will make him a legend. There's Anthony Heinsius, the Dutch Grand Pensionary whose diplomatic skills will hold the anti-French coalition together through 13 years of defeats, victories, and near collapse. But here's what makes this war particularly devastating. It's not just about European politics. The Spanish Empire includes vast territories in the Americas, lucrative trade routes in the Pacific, and strategic strongholds in Italy and the Low Countries. Control of Spain means control of silver mines in Peru, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and trading posts from Manila to Cadiz. This isn't just a European war, it's a world war, and every major power has global interest at stake. The economic implications are staggering. Spain controls roughly 40% of world silver production. Its American colonies generate wealth that funds European armies and European ambitions. Its trade routes connect Asia, America, and Europe in a web of commercial relationships that make certain cities rich and others irrelevant. Whoever controls Spanish trade controls global commerce, and in an age when commerce increasingly determines political power, that control is worth any price. So when Charles II dies on November 1st, 1700, and his will is read publicly in Madrid, the response isn't just diplomatic. It's immediate and militant. Louis XIV accepts the inheritance on behalf of his grandson and begins moving French troops into Spanish territories. Leopold I rejects the will and starts assembling a coalition to contest it. William III begins negotiating alliances and preparing for war. The great powers of Europe start choosing sides in what everyone knows will be a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. The war officially begins in 1701, but the real action starts much earlier. French armies are already moving into the Spanish Netherlands. Austrian forces are mobilizing along the Rhine. English and Dutch fleets are preparing to challenge French control of Spanish trade routes. This isn't a war that erupts suddenly. It's a war that builds like a storm system, drawing energy from every grievance, every ambition, and every fear that has been accumulating in European politics for decades. The Alliance of The Hague, signed on September 7, 1701, formally commits England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic to war against France. The treaty is a masterpiece of diplomatic language that tries to disguise the essential fact that Europe's great powers are about to tear each other apart over an inheritance dispute. The Allies claim they're fighting to preserve the balance of power, to protect Protestant interests, and to prevent French hegemony. They're not wrong, but they're also fighting for trade routes, colonial territories, and dynastic prestige. The French response is swift and characteristically Louis XIV. He recognizes Philip V as the legitimate king of Spain, sends French administrators to Madrid, and begins treating Spanish resources as French assets. More provocatively, he moves French troops into Spanish strongholds in the Low Countries, threatens Dutch borders, and starts interfering in English succession politics by recognizing the exiled James II as the rightful king of England. If the Allies wanted proof that French control of Spain meant French dominance of Europe, Louis is happy to provide it. But wars aren't won in diplomatic conferences or royal proclamations. They're won on battlefields, in sieges, and in the grinding attrition of armies, economies, and national willpower. And as 1702 dawns, Europe is about to discover just how expensive royal ambitions can be when they're pursued with early modern warfare. The opening campaigns are a disaster for almost everyone involved. The Allies have superior numbers and strong positions, but they're fighting a coalition war against a unified enemy, and coalition warfare is always complicated. The English want to focus on naval operations and colonial warfare. The Austrians want to concentrate on Italy and the Rhineland. The Dutch want to protect their borders and their trade routes. Coordinating these different priorities while maintaining political unity proves nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the French are fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts with limited resources and uncertain allies. Spain provides territory and legitimacy, but Spanish armies are poorly equipped and worse led. French forces are stretched from Flanders to Catalonia to northern Italy. Even Louis XIV's legendary military machine begins to show strain under the pressure of global warfare. The first major engagement comes at the Battle of Chiari in 1701, where Prince Eugene of Savoy defeats a larger French force through superior positioning and tactical innovation. It's a small victory, but it demonstrates that French armies aren't invincible, and that the Allies have commanders capable of beating them. The psychological impact is enormous. For the first time in decades, a French army has been decisively defeated by an inferior force, and European confidence in French military superiority begins to crack. But Eugene's victory is followed by French successes in the Low Countries, where Marshal Boufflers captures several Dutch strongholds and threatens Amsterdam itself. The war begins to take on the character that will define it for the next decade. Series of victories and defeats, sieges that drag on for months, campaigns that achieve nothing decisive, and battles that cost thousands of lives without changing the strategic situation significantly. The human cost becomes apparent quickly. Armies in 1702 are larger than anything Europe has seen before. French forces number over 200,000 men. The Grand Alliance eventually fields nearly 300,000 troops. These aren't feudal levies fighting for a few weeks before returning to their farms. These are professional armies that campaign for entire seasons, require massive logistical support, and consume resources on a scale that strains even the wealthiest economies. The soldiers themselves are a mixture of volunteers, pressed men, and foreign mercenaries. Many are career soldiers who've been fighting for years in various European conflicts. Others are farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who've been swept up in the general mobilization. Most are poorly equipped by modern standards, armed with muskets that miss fire in wet weather, supplied with uniforms that fall apart after a few months of campaigning, and fed on rations that barely prevent starvation. Disease kills more soldiers than combat. Armies that begin campaigns with 20,000 men often end them with fewer than 10,000 still fit for duty. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox spread through military camps like wildfire. Medical care consists primarily of amputation and prayer. Wounded soldiers who survive their injuries often die from infection, starvation, or exposure during long retreats. The battles themselves are exercises in controlled chaos. Armies line up in formal formations and blast away at each other with muskets and cannons until one side breaks. Cavalry charges attempt to exploit gaps in enemy lines. Infantry advances in columns and fights hand-to-hand with bayonets and swords. Artillery bombardments destroy fortifications and terrorize defenders. The noise is overwhelming, the confusion total, and the carnage appalling. Take the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, one of the war's decisive engagements. John Churchill, now Duke of Marlborough, leads a combined English-Austrian-Dutch army against a French-Bavarian force under Marshal Tallard. The battle lasts from dawn to dusk, involves over 100,000 men, and ends with one of the most complete victories in military history. Marlborough doesn't just defeat the enemy, he destroys them. French casualties exceed 20,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Tallard himself is taken prisoner. Bavaria is knocked out of the war. French prestige suffers a blow from which it never fully recovers. But Blenheim comes at a cost. Allied casualties approach 10,000 men. Entire regiments are wiped out. Some units lose 70% of their strength in a single day's fighting. The economic cost is staggering. Equipping and supplying the army for this one campaign bankrupts several German principalities and forces England to borrow money at ruinous interest rates. And Blenheim, devastating as it is for the French, doesn't end the war. It barely changes the strategic situation. French armies retreat but regroup. Louis XIV replaces his losses and continues fighting. The war enters its middle phase, a grinding period of siege warfare, economic exhaustion, and political strain that will test every participant's capacity for sustained conflict. Siege warfare dominates the middle years of the conflict, and siege warfare in this period is particularly brutal. Fortified cities are invested by armies that surround them completely, cutting off all supplies and communications. defenders are slowly starved into submission, while attackers dig elaborate trench systems that allow them to approach city walls under cover. Artillery bombardments destroy buildings, kill civilians, and gradually reduce fortifications to rubble. The siege of Barcelona in 1705 illustrates the horror. The city holds out for nearly a year against French forces while its population slowly starves. Children die of malnutrition. Adults fight over scraps of bread. Disease spreads through overcrowded neighborhoods where sanitation has completely broken down. When the city finally surrenders, the survivors are skeletal figures barely recognizable as human beings. Meanwhile, the economic impact of the war spreads far beyond military operations. Trade routes are disrupted as privateers and naval forces attack merchant shipping. Colonial territories change hands repeatedly as European powers extend their conflict to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Sugar production in the Caribbean collapses as labor forces are disrupted and shipping becomes too dangerous. Silver shipments from Spanish America are intercepted by enemy fleets or diverted to fund military operations. The human cost isn't limited to soldiers and civilians in war zones. Taxation reaches levels that impoverish entire regions. French peasants pay taxes that consume nearly half their income. English merchants see their profits disappear as trade routes are disrupted and insurance costs skyrocket. Dutch fishermen lose their livelihoods as naval warfare makes the North Sea too dangerous for commercial fishing. Religious tensions add another layer of complexity to the conflict. The war becomes a struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers, with each side claiming divine sanction for their cause. French propagandists present the conflict as a crusade to restore Catholic unity to Europe. English pamphleteers describe it as a Protestant struggle against Catholic tyranny. These religious dimensions make compromise more difficult and fighting more vicious. The war's global character becomes increasingly apparent as the conflict spreads to every continent. In North America, English and French colonists fight Queen Anne's War, a parallel conflict that involves raids on frontier settlements, sieges of colonial fortresses, and diplomatic negotiations with Native American tribes. The fighting is sporadic but brutal, with civilian populations bearing much of the cost. In the Caribbean, English and Dutch fleets attack Spanish and French possessions while privateers of all nationalities prey on merchant shipping. Sugar plantations are destroyed, slave populations are dispersed, and trade networks that have taken generations to build are shattered in a few years of warfare. Even in Asia, the conflict has repercussions. English and Dutch trading companies compete for control of spice routes, while French influence in India begins to challenge British commercial interests. The war, that began as a European succession dispute, becomes a truly global struggle for commercial and colonial dominance. By 1706, all participants are showing signs of exhaustion. France has mobilized its entire population for war, but struggles to maintain armies on multiple fronts. England has borrowed so much money that debt service consumes nearly half the national budget. Austria's Italian territories are devastated by years of campaigning. The Dutch economy is in ruins as trade routes remain disrupted and military expenditures continue to mount. Political strain begins to show within the alliances. The English Parliament starts questioning whether the war's costs are worth its potential benefits. Austrian generals complain that they're fighting for English commercial interests rather than Habsburg dynastic claims. Dutch politicians wonder whether their country can survive another year of military expenditures at current levels. But the war continues because no one can figure out how to end it. The fundamental issues that caused the conflict remain unresolved. France still controls Spain and its empire. The Allies still consider this unacceptable. Compromise proposals founder on questions of trade rights, territorial compensation, and dynastic legitimacy that no one can resolve without appearing to surrender their essential interests. The war's character begins to change as it drags on. Early campaigns featured massive set-piece battles where armies fought for decisive results. Middle-period warfare becomes a series of sieges and maneuvers designed more to exhaust the enemy than to defeat them decisively. Both sides start employing strategies of attrition, accepting that victory will come to whoever can endure suffering longest rather than whoever fights most brilliantly. Marlborough's campaigns in the Low Countries illustrate this evolution. After Blenheim, he focuses on capturing key fortresses rather than seeking major battles. His sieges of Lille, Tournai, and Mons are masterpieces of military engineering, but cost enormous casualties and consume vast resources. Each success brings the Allies marginally closer to France, but at a price that makes ultimate victory seem increasingly expensive. French strategy adapts accordingly. Instead of seeking decisive battles where superior numbers might matter, French commanders focus on defensive warfare, designed to make Allied advances as costly as possible. They trade territory for time, accepting the loss of peripheral positions while preserving core French territory in Spanish control. This strategic shift has devastating consequences for civilian populations caught between the armies. The Low Countries, northern Italy, and the Rhineland become permanent war zones where normal life becomes impossible. Farmers abandon their fields rather than lose their crops to foraging armies. Merchants stop traveling as trade routes become battlefields. Entire regions are depopulated as civilians flee to safer areas. The war's impact on European culture is equally profound. A generation of young men grows up knowing nothing but warfare. Traditional social hierarchies are disrupted as military service becomes the primary path to advancement. Economic relationships that have existed for centuries are shattered by military requirements and wartime taxation. Literature and art begin to reflect the war's influence. Writers produce works that grapple with questions of loyalty, sacrifice, and the cost of political ambition. Artists create images of battlefield carnage and civilian suffering that challenge traditional heroic depictions of warfare. Music and theater explore themes of loss, displacement, and the breakdown of social order. The war also accelerates political and economic changes that will reshape European society. The massive costs of military operations force governments to develop new methods of taxation and borrowing. England creates the Bank of England to manage war debt. France expands its system of royal administrators to extract resources more efficiently. The Dutch Republic pioneers new forms of commercial finance to support military operations. These institutional innovations survive the war and become permanent features of European political economy. The fiscal military state, where government power depends on the ability to tax, borrow, and spend on military operations, emerges as the dominant form of political organization. Traditional feudal relationships based on personal loyalty and land tenure give way to more modern systems based on law, taxation, and bureaucratic administration. The war's final phase begins around 1708 as all participants approach the limits of their endurance. France faces economic collapse as consecutive harvest failures combine with military expenditures to create widespread famine. England struggles with political opposition to a war that has consumed the entire national debt and shows no signs of ending. Austria's armies are exhausted after years of fighting on multiple fronts with insufficient resources. The Battle of Malplaquet in 1709 epitomizes the war's final character. Marlborough achieves another tactical victory over the French, but Allied casualties are so severe that the victory feels like defeat. Over 20,000 men are killed or wounded in a single day's fighting. and the strategic situation remains essentially unchanged. Both armies retire to winter quarters, knowing that another year of similar battles will destroy them regardless of who wins. Diplomatic efforts to end the war intensify as military solutions become increasingly implausible. Peace negotiations begin in various locations, but founder repeatedly on irreconcilable demands. France offers to abandon Spain, but wants to keep Spanish territories in Italy and the Low Countries. The Allies demand complete French withdrawal from all Spanish territories, but offer no compensation for 13 years of warfare. The negotiations are complicated by the personal and dynastic issues that created the war. Louis XIV cannot abandon his grandson's claim to Spain without appearing to admit that his entire war effort has been wrong. Emperor Leopold cannot accept French control of any Spanish territory without abandoning the Habsburg claims that justify Austrian participation in the war. William III's death in 1702 and Queen Anne's accession to the English throne add another layer of complexity as English priorities shift slightly. But the war's global character makes purely European solutions impossible. Any peace settlement must address colonial territories in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia, where fighting continues regardless of European politics. Commercial interests that have invested heavily in wartime privateering and colonial conquest resist peace terms that threaten their profits. Military contractors who have grown wealthy supplying armies have strong incentives to continue the conflict. The war finally ends, not because anyone achieves their objectives, but because everyone becomes too exhausted to continue fighting. Charles VI succeeds to the Austrian throne in 1711, and his possible inheritance of Spain creates the same balance of power concerns that originally motivated the Allies to fight against French control. English politics shift as Tory opposition to the war gains strength and Marlborough falls from favor. The treaties of Utrecht in 1713 and Rastatt in 1714 formally conclude the conflict through a series of compromises that leave everyone partially satisfied and partially frustrated. Philip V remains King of Spain but renounces any claim to the French throne. Austria receives Spanish territories in Italy and the Low Countries as compensation for abandoning its claim to Spain itself. England gains commercial concessions including the asiento, the right to supply slaves to Spanish America, and control of Gibraltar and Minorca. France keeps its own territory intact, but accepts significant limitations on its power. Louis XIV must demolish the fortifications at Dunkirk, recognize the Protestant succession in England, and accept that French and Spanish crowns can never be united. These terms preserve French independence while constraining French expansion. The human cost of achieving this settlement is staggering. Military casualties exceed 400,000 dead and wounded. Civilian deaths from disease, starvation, and military action approach 700,000. Economic losses from destroyed trade, abandoned agriculture, and military expenditures represent decades of normal economic growth. Entire regions require years to recover from wartime devastation. The war's consequences extend far beyond the immediate settlement. It establishes the principle of balance of power as the governing concept in European international relations. No single state will be allowed to achieve continental hegemony, and other powers will combine to prevent such dominance. This principle will shape European politics for the next 2 centuries and contribute to the origins of both world wars. The conflict also accelerates the development of global commerce and colonial competition. English commercial advantages gained through the war help establish British dominance of international trade. Dutch decline becomes apparent as the Republic's economy fails to recover from wartime losses. French colonial empire begins to lag behind English expansion in North America and Asia. Perhaps, most significantly, the war demonstrates that dynastic disputes and royal ambitions can have consequences far beyond the immediate interests of ruling families. Millions of people who had no voice in the decision to fight bore the primary cost of royal competition. This realization will contribute to growing criticism of absolute monarchy and increasing demands for popular participation in political decision-making. The War of Spanish Succession ends not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Louis XIV, now an old man, survives to see his ambitions frustrated and his kingdom impoverished. The Habsburg claim to Spain is permanently lost, but Austria gains significant territorial compensation. England emerges as the dominant naval and commercial power, but struggles with debt that will influence its policies for decades. The soldiers who survive return to peacetime occupations with memories of carnage that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The civilians who endured years of warfare begin the slow process of rebuilding communities, economies, and families disrupted by 13 years of conflict. The diplomats who negotiated the peace settlement hope they have created a stable system that will prevent future wars of similar scale and destructiveness. They are wrong. The settlement contains contradictions and compromises that will generate new conflicts within a generation. The balance of power system requires constant vigilance and periodic warfare to maintain. Colonial competition intensifies rather than diminishes. Religious and dynastic disputes continue to influence European politics. But for the moment in 1714, Europe is at peace. The guns are silent. The armies have disbanded. The siege lines have been abandoned. Merchants begin to re-establish trade routes. Farmers return to their fields. Children, who have known nothing but warfare, begin to imagine what peacetime might offer. The war that began with one man's will and another man's ambition is over. It consumed a generation, bankrupted kingdoms, and killed millions. It reshaped the map of Europe and the balance of global power. It demonstrated both the potential and the limits of early modern state power, and it established precedents for international relations that will influence European politics until the system it created finally destroys itself in the catastrophes of the 20th century. The royal affair that sparked this war was really a family dispute about inheritance and prestige. But when families rule kingdoms and kingdoms control empires, family disputes become world wars. The lesson of the War of Spanish Succession is not that royal ambitions are particularly evil or that dynastic politics are inherently destructive. The lesson is that when political power is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals whose personal interests may conflict with their subjects' welfare, the consequences of their decisions can be catastrophic for everyone else. Charles II's decision to bequeath Spain to a French prince seemed reasonable from his perspective. It preserved Spanish territorial integrity and recognized the reality of French power in European politics. But it also triggered a conflict that killed more people than any previous European war, and established patterns of international competition that would shape the modern world. The war's ultimate irony is that it achieved neither its stated objectives nor its participants' real goals. Spain remained independent but under French influence. The balance of power was preserved but required constant warfare to maintain. Trade routes were secured but remained vulnerable to future conflicts. Religious unity was neither achieved nor abandoned. The dynastic issues that caused the war were resolved through compromise rather than victory. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of the War of Spanish Succession. Wars that begin with clear objectives often end with ambiguous results that satisfy no one completely, but exhaust everyone sufficiently to make peace temporarily attractive. The royal affair that started this conflict was resolved not through the triumph of right over wrong, but through the exhaustion of all parties' capacity to continue fighting. And in the end, after 13 years of warfare that spanned continents and consumed millions of lives, Europe found itself with a settlement that could have been negotiated in 1701 if pride, ambition, and the logic of royal honor had not made compromise impossible until catastrophe made it inevitable. The war was both necessary and pointless, both decisive and inconclusive, both a triumph of early modern statecraft and a demonstration of its fundamental limitations. This is what happens when royal affairs spark world wars. This is the price of dynastic politics in an age of global empire. This is the War of Spanish Succession. But the story doesn't end with treaty signatures and diplomatic handshakes. The real consequences of this royal mess are just beginning to unfold, and they'll ripple through history like cracks in ice, spreading outward until they reshape the entire structure of European civilization. Picture yourself in a London coffeehouse in 1715, the year after the war officially ends. You're nursing a cup of bitter Turkish coffee that costs more than a laborer's daily wage, listening to merchants argue about trade routes and politicians debate the national debt. The air smells of tobacco smoke, wet wool, and the particular anxiety that comes from realizing your country has borrowed more money than it can possibly repay. Someone at the next table is reading aloud from a pamphlet about the South Sea Company, a new venture designed to trade with Spanish America using rights gained in the recent peace settlement. The numbers sound impressive. The profits seem guaranteed. The only problem is that most of it is built on wishful thinking and financial speculation that will eventually collapse into one of history's first major stock market crashes. This is what victory looks like when you win a war, but bankrupt yourself in the process. England has gained Gibraltar, Minorca, and valuable commercial privileges, but the cost of achieving these prizes has fundamentally altered the relationship between government and governed. Parliament now controls taxation and military spending in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war. The monarchy survives, but with reduced power. The aristocracy remains influential, but shares authority with merchant interests and financial speculators who funded the war effort. The social changes are equally dramatic. A generation of officers has returned from continental warfare with experience of military organization, engineering techniques, and administrative methods that they apply to civilian pursuits. Veterans establish businesses, improve agricultural practices, and introduce manufacturing innovations learned during military campaigns. The war has been a massive, expensive education in practical skills that peacetime society can finally put to productive use. But not everyone benefits from these changes. The soldiers who fought in muddy trenches and bloody sieges often return home to find that civilian life offers few opportunities for men whose primary skills involve killing efficiently and following orders without question. Rural communities that sent their young men to war find themselves with depleted labor forces and disrupted social structures. Widows and orphans struggle to survive without the male relatives who provided economic support. The economic transformation is even more profound than the social disruption. 13 years of massive government borrowing has created financial institutions and practices that will dominate European economics for centuries. The Bank of England, established to manage war debt, becomes a model for central banking that other countries will imitate. Government bonds, issued to fund military operations, create new forms of investment that transform the relationship between private wealth and public finance. These financial innovations have political consequences that their creators never anticipated. When governments depend on borrowed money to function, they become accountable to lenders in ways that limit their freedom of action. Bondholders demand fiscal responsibility and policy stability that protect their investments. Military adventures that threaten government solvency become politically dangerous because they alarm the financial interests that keep the state functioning. The war's colonial legacy proves equally complex and long-lasting. English gains in North America include Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, territories that provide strategic advantages but also create new administrative challenges and military responsibilities. The asiento, the right to supply slaves to Spanish America, involves England directly in the Atlantic slave trade on a scale that makes the country complicit in human trafficking that will eventually generate its own moral and political crises. French colonial losses in North America mark the beginning of a long decline that will culminate in the complete loss of New France during the 7 Years' War. But French involvement in India begins to expand as administrators and soldiers seek opportunities to compensate for European failures. The global balance of power hasn't been settled by the War of Spanish Succession. It's been redistributed in ways that will generate new conflicts as colonial competition intensifies. Spanish America emerges from the war with a different relationship to European politics. Philip V's reign introduces French administrative methods and commercial practices that increase colonial efficiency, but also create new tensions between local interests and metropolitan control. The Bourbon reforms that follow the war will eventually contribute to independence movements that destroy the Spanish Empire in the early 19th century. The technological and organizational lessons of the war spread throughout European society, with consequences that extend far beyond military affairs. Engineering techniques developed for siege warfare find applications in canal construction, mining operations, and urban planning. Military contractors who learn to supply armies efficiently apply their logistics expertise to commercial distribution networks. Administrative methods designed to manage complex military operations influence civilian bureaucracy and business organization. Medical knowledge advances significantly during the war as military surgeons develop new techniques for treating battlefield injuries. These innovations slowly filter into civilian medical practice, improving survival rates for accidents and diseases that previously meant certain death. But the medical advances come at a terrible cost in human experimentation. Battlefield surgery is performed on conscious patients without anesthesia. Amputation techniques are perfected through repetitive practice on wounded soldiers. Disease prevention methods are discovered by observing what kills armies and trying to avoid those conditions. The war's religious consequences prove particularly complex because they involve both political calculations and genuine theological concerns. Protestant victory over Catholic powers strengthens English and Dutch confidence in their religious and political systems. But it also creates new religious minorities in conquered territories where Catholic populations must now live under Protestant rulers. The integration of these religious differences requires compromises and accommodations that gradually weaken the connection between religious identity and political loyalty. Military culture changes fundamentally during and after the war. Professional armies replace feudal levies as the primary means of organized violence. Officers study mathematics, engineering, and foreign languages to improve their military effectiveness. Soldiers receive regular training rather than learning their trade during combat. Military academies are established to provide systematic education for future commanders. These changes create a military class whose skills and loyalties are focused on the state rather than on personal relationships or regional interests. The transformation of military culture has profound implications for civilian society. Veterans bring organizational skills and technical knowledge to peacetime occupations. Military engineering techniques improve road construction, bridge building, and industrial machinery. The discipline and hierarchy of Army life influence social relationships and business practices. Even fashion changes as military styles influence civilian clothing, making uniforms and military decorations part of normal social display. Women's roles evolve significantly during the war, as traditional social structures are disrupted by male absence and economic necessity. Women manage farms, run businesses, and make decisions that would normally be reserved for male heads of household. Some women follow armies as camp followers, providing laundry, nursing, and other services that armies require, but don't formally provide. These experiences create precedents for female independence and capability that will influence post-war social development. The intellectual impact of the war is equally significant, though less immediately obvious. Philosophers and political theorists begin questioning the legitimacy of dynastic warfare and absolute monarchy. If royal family disputes can consume entire generations and bankrupt whole kingdoms, perhaps political power should be organized differently. The concept of popular sovereignty gains strength as an alternative to dynastic legitimacy. Ideas about natural rights, social contracts, and limited government spread through European intellectual circles. Literature and art respond to the war's carnage with new forms of expression that challenge traditional heroic narratives. Writers begin exploring themes of individual suffering and moral ambiguity, rather than focusing exclusively on noble sacrifice and patriotic duty. Artists create works that depict warfare's brutality rather than its glory. Music evolves to express emotions and experiences that traditional forms cannot capture adequately. The economic disruption caused by the war forces fundamental changes in agricultural and commercial practices. Traditional subsistence farming gives way to market-oriented agriculture as farmers seek profits to pay wartime taxes. Regional trade networks expand as military supply requirements create demand for goods that must be transported over long distances. Urban centers grow as displaced rural populations seek employment in wartime industries. These economic changes create new social classes and interest groups whose political influence will reshape European society. Merchants and manufacturers who prospered during the war demand political representation proportional to their economic importance. Agricultural improvers who increased productivity seek policies that protect their investments and encourage further innovation. Financial speculators who funded government borrowing want political stability that protects their returns. The transformation of European society during and after the War of Spanish Succession illustrates how major conflicts change far more than just political boundaries and military balances. Wars of this scale and duration reorganize entire civilizations, creating new institutions, new social relationships, and new ways of understanding politics, economics, and human nature itself. The irony is that these profound changes often have little connection to the original causes of the conflict. Charles II's succession crisis and Louis XIV's dynastic ambitions seem almost trivial compared to the revolutionary transformations they set in motion. The war began as a dispute about royal inheritance and ended as a catalyst for social, economic, and political modernization that would reshape European civilization. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of the War of Spanish Succession. Major historical events often produce consequences that are far more significant than their apparent causes. A dying king's will triggers changes that outlast the dynasties and empires that fought over his legacy. Royal family disputes become catalysts for social revolutions that transform the relationship between rulers and ruled. The war that began with one man's death and another man's ambition becomes the foundation for a new kind of European society based on financial capitalism, professional bureaucracy, and limited government. The royal affair that started the conflict disappears into historical footnotes, while its consequences continue shaping the modern world. And somewhere in those London coffee houses where merchants argue about trade and politicians debate debt, the future is being born from the ashes of dynastic warfare. The age of absolute monarchy is ending, not through revolution or dramatic political change, but through the gradual accumulation of practical necessities created by 13 years of ruinously expensive conflict. This is how history really works. Not through the grand gestures of kings and conquerors, but through the slow transformation of ordinary life by forces too large and complex for any individual to control or understand completely. The War of Spanish Succession killed millions, bankrupted kingdoms, and reshaped continents. But its most lasting legacy may be the quiet revolution it sparked in how Europeans thought about power, authority, and the relationship between public duty and private interest. The royal affair that began this story ends in silence, forgotten by everyone except historians who study dynastic genealogies and diplomatic archives. But the changes it set in motion continue reverberating through time, creating the foundations for everything that follows. Wars end, but their consequences echo through centuries, shaping the future in ways that no one could predict when the first shots were fired. This is what makes the War of Spanish Succession both typical and unique among the great conflicts of European history. Typical because it began with the usual mixture of dynastic ambition, commercial competition, and balance of power politics that motivated most early modern warfare. Unique because it lasted long enough and cost enough to fundamentally alter the societies that fought it. The men who started this war are all dead now, their ambitions buried with them. But the world they created through 13 years of conflict survives, transformed beyond recognition from what any of them intended or imagined. That world becomes the foundation for everything that follows: the Industrial Revolution, the American and French revolutions, the rise of democratic government, and eventually the global conflicts of the 20th century that will make the War of Spanish Succession look like a minor regional dispute. History is full of such ironies. Royal family quarrels become world wars. Dynastic disputes become social revolutions. Personal ambitions become impersonal forces that reshape civilization itself. The War of Spanish Succession is just one example of how small causes can have enormous consequences when they interact with the complex systems that govern human society. And in the end, that may be the most sobering lesson of all. We live in a world shaped by decisions made by people who are long dead, for reasons we can barely understand, with consequences they never anticipated. The royal affair that sparked the War of Spanish Succession reminds us that history is not a rational process controlled by wise planners with clear objectives. It's a chaotic interaction of human ambitions, institutional constraints, and unintended consequences that produces results no one could have predicted or planned. The war is over, the dead are buried, the treaties are signed, but the story continues, spreading outward through time like ripples on water, touching lives and shaping events in ways that connect the early 18th century to the present day. This is how one royal affair sparked a war that killed millions and changed the world forever.